If most evangelicals look at their history, it's a common development.
Yes.
I don't want to name denominations, but I got another in my mind whose whole idea was, we're not a denomination, we're just a gathering of people committed to missions.
Yes.
Well, pretty soon they began using their dogma as divisions amongst themselves, dividing into other groups. So your journey back to the church begins with this dichotomy of reading the history in the Apostolic Fathers, but it took 20 years.
It took 20 years. When people ask me, well, why did it take you so long? An image that comes most often to my mind is, I received two things from my mother's breast: a profound love for Jesus Christ and the Scriptures, and the certitude that Catholicism was wrong. In our family, we were not raised anti-Catholic, but theologically we were framed in such a way that if you received the teaching, you ended up opposing Catholicism. And so one of my instincts were, well, even though I began to see the Apostolic Fathers as a witness to the true witness to the earliest days of the Church, I knew for a fact that they were not Catholic. I just knew it. And so that assumption, that prejudice, lasted quite a while. And in fact, it would take many years and a journey through the Anglican tradition and the Charismatic Episcopal Church to...
We'll talk about that. Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about your journey there, because you did actually move out of the Plymouth Brethren.
Yes. When I was in seminary, when I finally decided not to play Jonah anymore and actually hear the call Christ had placed on my life, I registered as a biblical studies major in my undergraduate work, and I started taking a class with Professor Bill Mulder at Trinity College. And every Monday morning he would give a devotional. And every Monday morning the devotional was profound. So after about 5 or 6 of these, I went up to him and I said, Professor Mulder, where do you get this stuff? And he says to me, and I can remember the tone of voice, he says, well, you know, Vaughn, the church is very old. And every day we celebrate the life of a saint. If that saint has written, I just read something from them. If they haven't written, I read something about them. And if you like this stuff, why don't you come visit us at St. Giles Episcopal Church? That was the key. The next Sunday, it was All Saints' Day. My wife and I went to St. Giles Episcopal Church. We walked in the door. We had come a little late. The liturgy had started. The incense was thick. They had processed around the church. By the time the procession was over, you couldn't even see across the aisle. I thought I had died and went to heaven. We walked out of church that day. My wife turns to me and says, don't ever ask me to come back here. But 9 months later, after being frustrated with the evangelical church we had been a part of for 2.5 years and still considered a guest, we woke up and said, you know what, let's go to St. Giles. At least we know there, then we'll figure out another church next week. So we showed up at St. Giles, and as we're walking into the narthex, a little old lady comes up to us and says, hi, Vaughn and Norma, where have you been the last 9 months? And my wife turns to me and says, as we're getting into the pew, if they care enough to remember our names after one visit for 9 months, then I'm prepared to listen to what they want to say. And so we stayed at St. Giles, and because of our time there, I was introduced to and convinced of 2 Catholic doctrines. They weren't presented to me as Catholic doctrines, they were just presented to me as the teachings of the church. The first one was baptismal regeneration. The second was the doctrine of transubstantiation. So from an Anglican parish, I was taught 2 fundamental Catholic doctrines. And what's intriguing to me is, if any Catholic had tried to teach me those doctrines, I would have turned a deaf ear. So what God couldn't do through a Catholic, he did through an Anglican.
From the Brethren standpoint, were both those sacraments ordinances, symbolic?
Yes, they were both ordinances.
Purely symbols of what had already happened by faith?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
So this was a substantial change. During that time, I also received confirmation through the Bishop of Chicago, Bishop Montgomery, the Anglican Bishop of Chicago. And that began my journey towards the ancient faith.
All right. Did you sense a call to the Anglican ministry?
Yes. Well, because I was training for seminary, this seemed to be God refining my call. So the Chicago Diocese accepted me as a sort of unofficial. They allowed me to function as an unofficial ordinand, and so I did all the things at St. Charles Episcopal Church that a normal candidate for ordination would do, but on an unofficial basis. But during that time, I had petitioned to serve the homosexual community in Chicago, and so my parish priest put in a petition for me, and then he came back to me and said, I don't think this is exactly what you had in mind, because at the time what had begun to happen was the Diocese of Chicago had changed its stance and was actually promoting the full embrace of the gay community within the Episcopal Church. And so rightly he understood that
your theology was not going to fit that glove.
Fit that glove.
Yeah.
And another thing happened at the same time. At this time, my dad, sensing that my conversion to apostolic Christianity was genuine, and knowing that I was considering the possibility of ordination in the Episcopal Church, asked me this question. He called me aside. He said, "Vaughn, I'm going to ask you a personal question. I'm not asking you if you've become convinced that the church had bishops, priests, and deacons. That I know you're convinced in your head. What I am asking you is, can you, Vaughn Treco, my son, raised the way you were raised, actually bow the knee to a man? Not do you want to, but can you?" That question saved me from ordination, because my dad understood me. He had perceived that although I was converted in my mind, there was a long road before I would be converted in my heart. And so that's saved me. So, fortunately, because my dad was a leader in the church I'd grown up in, despite the fact that I had accepted certain theological positions, they could not. They were open to having me serve as a term of gratitude. I completed my seminary studies, and so they welcomed me back to Grace Gospel Chapel, and I served for 2 years as a minister in training. And they were 2 wonderful years for me.
How did you end up in the Charismatic Episcopal Church?
Yeah. Well, what happened was, because of the differences, we knew that by the time I reached ordination, I would be going in a different direction. So they ordained me as a church planting pastor, and I, after my ordination, helped to launch New Providence Community Church in Nassau, Bahamas, with Clint Kemp, another pastor, youth pastor in the area. And we had started New Providence Community Church with a view to establishing a creedal community with a radically contemporary evangelistic outreach form. And this was my last attempt to live within the evangelical community, to try to work out what I had learned from church history. And what happened was, about 2 years into that project, which still grows today, by the way, I realized that Clint and I had a disagreement about the role of the creeds in the formation of the people of God. And because I had gone through a split as a young man, a church split, I had decided I would never be party to that. So I resigned from my post there and made a commitment to enter an apostolic community. And that is what led me to the Charismatic Episcopal Church.
All right. Now, eventually